Now, this first panel of today is called Activism and Regional Solidarity in the Light of the War. And it is no secret that the war in Ukraine has really amplified the divisions on the left. Systemic analysis of the war, I think, far too often neglected the crucial role of Russian imperialism in the conflict and tended to blame the United States as the sort of only imperial protagonist in the international affairs. At the same time, some segments of the left have been accused of basically reproducing liberal foreign policy thinking. But what I think we can say with a certain degree of certainty is that perhaps the most comprehensive analyses of the war have been penned in East Central Europe, be it in Kiev or Warsaw, for example. And I think that this really highlights the crucial role of the activists from the post-Soviet space in developing nuanced accounts of the war, policy responses to it, and perhaps most significantly, the networks of solidarity with people in Ukraine, but also people in Russia.
All this grassroots activism, we can work with women, and we need to transform all this work to some political work, because women need to be represented in the political life. They need to represent women's needs, because now feminists know much more about women's needs, and they need to to put it into the public space. So I think that on the other hand, we have some problem, and I call it bad timing. It's women are doing lots, but we have it's not a time for the domestic violence problems, for example. It's not a time to think about gender quotas in politics and other stuff, because the war is on the first place now. It's our everyday agenda. But I think that we need to make all these questions on the first lines and first agendas too, because it's never a good time. But we need to do something and to continue our work as much as we can. So another thing that I wanted to say, that often I see and I heard from women who are not involved in the feminist movement. They don't know a lot about it, and they always think that my mother she thought that it's okay. The politics and other stuff, it's something about these great people who are doing and who can decide everything. And I'm not involved in that, and it's okay for me. I am very individual. And I think that for us, it's important to unite women and to let them know that they can decide. They can decide political life. They can decide, some social movements. So for me, it's like a direction that I want to improve to do in Socialnyi Rukh in the future, and for now maybe, yeah. And I think that regarding this, now on our war agenda, we have a very big focus on the men's contribution to the war, because men are in the armed forces. We are talking a lot about the front lines and what are happening, because they defend us. But we have lots women's work on the home front, and we have lots of women in the army. and their contribution is also very important, and we need to talk about these too. And in this point, I want to mention something about women in the army now, because it's a lot. Like 50,000 women are now in the armed forces in Ukraine, and 1,000 of them are commanders, and the 2 are generals. And the newest information that 5,000 of them are on the hot front line. They do as much work as the men do.
And also we need in this network we are trying to make, because we are working with a very grassroots organization in the east, central, in the west a bit less than in the east, but main focus was close, the territories close to contact line from one side and from the other side. And when we go to help people, because for us it's a women and the human being and the human rights, it's a central point of our activities. And when we are trying to help people, we violate with the rules of the states, or so-called states, because these states exist to protect states and borders of these states and rules and laws and everything, but sometimes they makes everyday life of ordinary people unbearable, because of the just, for example, before the 24th February, we had a big problem with situation how the Ukrainian government recognized people from non-government controlled territories, because they had the same passports but not the same rights. So it was not so good situation for human rights and for the, and we also mentioned these like drivers for conflict, because it's like for Russia it was like an entry point to destroy the system from the Institute of Citizenship, because they try to share this citizenship of Russia for all these territories. And for these people, there was a key to survive, because they feel like excluded from any society. So, and we also need to pay attention to this also, because I'm not going to advocate any Russian at all, but I also don't want to advocate Ukrainian government that made also a lot of fails, but it not mean that I don't know, excuse this invasion and because they destroyed our lives at all. And therefore my work is not always welcome by Ukrainian government, because we critique Ukrainian government, also because of the restriction and in social sphere, and because of this situation which going on now with the labor rights. And I'm on the website of Peacemaker. It's like a special website for treaters of motherland, because it's like explain this on this site, because I was able to work from one side in another side. And for me it was extremely important to be in touch with the people who have to be on other side, because not everybody who in other cross the border, it's not our enemies. Because in Ukraine, Ukrainian government now try to build this narrative like all, for example, Russians, it's our enemies. And all Ukrainians, it's enemies of Russians. In another narrative, it's like all people on occupied territories are enemies. But it's not true, because the reason why you are in this place very different. and we are like activists and like humanitarian aid activists, like feminists who help in humanitarian sphere. We are trying to build this connection between people to help these people, and of course government and so-called government not welcome these activities. And also I was detained for a couple of days in Donetsk, also because for them I'm also like a spy, or I don't know what they mean. So it's of course it's not about my risk or I don't know something about this. It's just also I want to put the like a picture, full picture of this story, because conflict, it's not just black and white. In this in conflict, in every conflict, we have human dimension.
Our so-called Eastern politics, polityka wschodnia, right? So how do we, and always, like, for example, regarding Belarus or Russia and Ukraine, our main principle was to support emancipatory democratic movements eastwards from Poland. So when there were protests in Moscow, we supported the Russian people and issued a statement for their struggle for democracy. We have not supported any individual like Navalny or whatever, but always our position was to listen to the people in that in the country that is kind of threatened and under authoritarian regime like that, like the Putinism. I think for me personally, and for lots of people in the party and on the left in Poland, 2014, the annexation of Crimea was where it became very clear to us that what we have, so the stuff that now Western Europeans are discovering suddenly in 2022, that Russia is not what they were thinking it is, and it's actually really almost like a neo-fascist, turbo-capitalist petrostate. Like, some people are discovering it now, that is kind of imperialistic. They have just discovered it, right? We were also under the impression, I was strongly under the impression that, okay, capitalism, but Russia is changing, you know, maybe it will indeed, this kind of idea that the Germans were having Wandel durch Handel, right, that maybe if we strengthen our ties this way, some stuff will start moving in the right direction. It looked quite okay, at least Russia was kind of also pacified on that imperialist level, we thought. But in 2014, for me, it was a big shock. So I joined the party in 2016, and there were two motivations for me. One was the annexation of Crimea and the green little men in Ukraine, and the rise of the right wing in Poland. So it was clear to me and to many Razem people that when Putin said A in Crimea, then he has to say B, right? And this happened this year, of course, and so we were quick to react and basically support all sorts of sanctions against Russia, and support armed and unarmed resistance of Ukrainians. And it was not only us that had that quick reaction and an immediate kind of realization what this actually means, that indeed Russian imperialism is not going away.
Let me move to a more positive aspect of this presentation. So, I mean, and yes, in Lithuania we don't quote Lenin, but I think things are changing. But I think it is appropriate here to precisely quote Lenin and Lenin's view on nationalisms, right? So there is a famous distinction that Lenin makes: the nationalism of the oppressor versus the nationalism of the oppressed. Yeah. So we ought to criticize the nationalism of the oppressor, and we need to support the nationalism to a certain extent of the oppressor. And clearly, Ukraine here is the oppressor, and of course, oppressed.
Everybody's oppressed.
Yes, Freudian slip. Yes. So the point. The point is very clear, but I think it is a valid point, very important point. And yes, so we need to support Ukraine here. And I think Žižek, no matter what views you have on Slavoj Žižek, but I think in one of his pieces, I think he's right to say, and I quote, "What is absolutely unacceptable for a true leftist is not only to support Russia, but also to make a more modest, neutral claim that the left is divided between pacifists and supporters of Ukraine, and that one should treat this division as a mirror fact which should not affect the left's global struggle against global capitalism." In other words, if we are pacifists, then our first goal should be to support global struggle against global capitalism, which is true, but nonetheless not at the cost of supporting Ukraine. Today one cannot be, and further another quote, "Today one cannot be a leftist if one does not unconditionally stand behind Ukraine. To be a leftist who shows understanding for Russia is like to be one of those leftists who, before Germany attacked the USSR, took seriously German anti-imperialism rhetoric directed at the UK and advocated in the war of Germany against France and the UK." I think the point is pretty much clear.
The final point that I want to touch upon is again an aspect of people getting directly involved in the war in Ukraine, and that is foreign fighters. This is a subject that I've been researching for several years now. And of course, right now, when the conflict in Ukraine is still unfolding, hard data is very difficult to come by. But the broad sort of expert understanding is that there are several thousand pro-Ukrainian fighters, and probably about half as many joining the cause on the pro-Russian side. Without going into too much details about the profiles and motivations that drive people in there, the couple of points I would like to raise are the following. First of all, the coverage that these fighters tend to get. An issue I raised already back when the conflict wasn't a war, when it was a much more simmering gray zone conflict in the early 2015 and 16. The way you tended to read about foreign fighters then, and you sort of still do today, are in the glossy cover stories where it's a highly personalized report in Vice, the New Yorker, even Deutsche Welle, what have you, with lots of pictures and lots of very personal stories. Interestingly enough, there has been a direct link between the showcasing of these fighters, some of who are professionals, some of whom less so. If you're interested, you can. I could direct you to research to read about it. But there has been a direct link between such glorifying profiles and the overwhelming outreach of untrained, unqualified civilian adventurers trying to get into the battlefield, which puts an undue burden on the people processing them and basically takes the resources away, usually, from the fighting to protecting these people who are bundled together in no small numbers without appropriate arms or training somewhere near the battlefield. So the media glorification of violence, and even if you would think about it in such, relatively positive terms, right? Taking up arms to really put your action where your thoughts are, to really go and stand up and fight for something you believe in. Well, the people who have walked the walk and fought the fight might have different opinions about the value of you basically standing up from this tent and taking the train to the nearest training center. Again, this should help inform your discourse when somebody casually mentioned, a Ukrainian man, why aren't you there? Well, there are pretty good reasons to mention a few, right? In the concluding parts of this point, I think it's also important to start thinking about the lack of compatibility of this public discourse about hero glorification and the practical thought for the aftermath of this war. Some countries since 2014 have legalized and even very publicly endorsed foreign fighting in Ukraine. However, none, absolutely zero countries, have instituted any sort of programs or help mechanisms for people who return having fought in Ukraine. There are no public programs comparable to regular army veterans that could help them deal with health issues, with psychological issues, that could help them with reintegration into the society, because it might not be so easy to just, sit basically in your car after having witnessed some awful action and, go to the supermarket and proceed as you were. So giving absolutely no forethought about how to care for these people who are, in my opinion, quite often, pretty mindlessly encouraged, is also something very important and something that we will all have to deal with once this conflict ends. In terms of fighters, both foreign and local, because huge numbers of Ukrainians are in the field, huge numbers of Ukrainians have flown in from abroad to join the fight. I am yet to hear of any considerations about their fate once the fighting is over. The traditional talks about reconciliation, disarmament, reintegration, nowhere to be heard right now. Of all the venting mechanisms and attempts to deal with the traumas that we're seeing now that I have discussed, the legal route, the public discourse, encouragements to fight, these are not the only ways. I mean, we have seen processes like truth and reconciliation commissions chosen instead of these witch hunts, and in some countries they have shown pretty promising success stories. Perhaps that could be one of the ways to be considered. It is definitely not my place to say. It is for the Ukrainian society to agree within itself what is the best way to heal it. But I think my main point that I want you to take away from my talk is that things are complex. There are no simple answers and no simple narratives. And we must not give in to the horrors that we're witnessing. We must not give in to the temptation to respond with the same horror or think that if we fail to do so, we are somehow being defenseless, helpless, or betraying Ukraine. So I encourage you to stand with Ukraine thoughtfully in complexity as life is. Thank you.